Justus, Upama floribit, Sicucerius, Libani. In Domo Domini, ad annunciandum misericordia tuam, in veritatem Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia,
Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.
Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. You have the message of eternal life.
Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.
The Lord be with you.
And with your
A
spirit.
reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he ceased, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. And he said to them, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone who is indebted to us. And lead us not into temptation. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In the 1970s, a great book went round France, written by the abbot of the Trappist monastery of Mont-des-Cats, André Louf. The title was Seigneur, apprends-nous à prier. Lord, teach us to pray, taken from this Gospel. And in it was an expose of the whole notion of spending one's life in union with God. The modalities of that union change according to one's state of life, but the optic is always the same, given that the structure of every human soul is the same, and that its destiny by divine will is that it should end up in that for which it was created, the beatific vision, degrees of which can be anticipated already on earth, though without sight, for faith is our sight. But the God that we love and awaits us is there. And many souls over the centuries have felt the need to anticipate that to the utmost degree, and to do nothing but love God. We had, actually, only yesterday, that Gospel of Martha and Mary, where the Lord encouraged just being with him and listening to him. The unum necessarium. And so it is that the Spirit of God, both in East and in West, has raised up saints who have been models and have set up patterns. And one of those is the saint of this day, St. Bruno. As it happened, it's the day I came back to Ireland in 2007 so as to embrace the eremitic life. It was the saint that I had known, as it were, in inverted commas, in those growing years in France, from 1976 to 1984. The habit is unchanged. The order is unchanged. He himself had not started off as a hermit. He went to Paris from Cologne in Germany, where he was born, studied there, may have been ordained there. It's not clear, the question of his priesthood. He ended up in Reims, it seems, as a canon, that he was certainly teaching there, and one of his pupils was the future Urban II, which would explain to a large extent the last part of his life. He tried to find the eremitic life after escaping from a whole scenario at Reims. There was a Simoniac archbishop there, Manasseh, and they were trying to get him deposed because of the way he'd been elected. Manasseh eventually was deposed, and there was a danger that he would be elected, Bruno, in his place. He fled all that. He found St. Robert of Molem. Now, Molem was an important monastery because of the influence of the Cistercians linked with it, because St. Robert eventually had to return to Molem. He was taken back by his community, but having left the heritage of the Novum Monasterium, the new monastery of Cito. And it would seem that the thirsting soul of Bruno found refreshment in the solitude around there, not in the monastery itself. Eventually, with companions, he found his way to the Bishop of Grenoble, Hugh, and he himself was a saint, and he had received a vision or a dream of these 7 stars, and that he was to be leading them to a place where they would be alone with their God. And he led them to the Massif of the Grand Chartreuse and encouraged them to stay there and to consecrate the place to prayer, which they did. Following the Eastern pattern, indeed in the statutes that word is used, our fathers followed a light from the east, Orientalem Lucem. The Lavra model is used, cells around a church, and radical solitude and silence and austerity and separation from the world, which have never changed. Numquam reformata, quia numquam deformata. never reformed because never deformed. Eventually, this link he had with the one who was to become Pope Urban II was to lead to his being unexpectedly called to Rome to be an advisor, personal advisor of the Pope, because his qualities were known. He obeyed, it was the voice of Christ, Vox Christi, but pleaded eventually to be allowed to return to his solitude for which he thirsted. And the Pope allowed that, and he went to the south of Italy, to Calabria, and there he founded the charter house of St. Bruno, which is still there, Cella San Bruno. And he died there, and his body is there and venerated very much on this day. But in the meantime, his brethren were starting to lose courage at the Lower Chartreuse itself, and he wrote back to them. We have words from his pen indicating how much he loved them and how he encouraged them not to get discouraged. They were obviously feeling the absence of their father. There is a tradition within the order that they were actually leaving and that the Madonna appeared to them and told them to stay. He also writes to the lay brothers and expresses great affection for them, for they took on this category of monks wearing a brown habit who would be doing the manual work which would make possible the life of the fathers, which was based essentially on the cell, only going out for choir, and that only at night and only in the morning and the evening. And they, to this day, have a separate formation and a separate life, except for certain things together. They are in choir, not in choir, but actually in their place in the brothers' part of the church for matins, except on, actually at Selignac it was always for matins, but then on Sundays and major feast days they would come next to us in choir for Lauds. They would actually come in towards the end of matins, all ready for the Te Deum. But then on weekdays they would go to their cells after matins because they had to get up earlier than the fathers. They had their own messa di familia, and then they would be working. Actually, they did make a change that they made the conventual mass open to the brothers as well, even on weekdays, and that brought it forward an hour. And they also made vespers open for the brothers, and that made vespers an hour later. That was adjusted when I was actually starting my formation years. And the difference is still there, except that since the Second Vatican Council, the brothers wear the same white habit as the fathers, and they also now have a complete vote in chapter. But the distinction in lifestyle is still there, and they are necessary. In fact, so necessary that it was the shortage of brothers that led to the closure of Selignac, where I was. There were vocations to the choir still, but without the brothers, the fathers cannot exist. What one is aware of in the Carthusian life is the great advantage of utter separation from the world, and also the continuity in the spirit and practice. It's gone on rather as on Mount Athos, and one feels that. In the cell, one has one's oratoire, the little oratory, which has the form of a choir stall. Here it is. And in it, one does the same thing as the other brothers in the other cells at the same time. The movements are those of the choir, essentially. And the movements are very precise. Everything is prescribed, even the bowing of the head. And the work happens within the cell. Downstairs there's a small workshop with simple woodwork instruments, a lathe, and one chops wood and so on, saws it, and use it for heating. And the garden is cultivated also because each cell is a little house essentially. And we still had clogs when we were working. And the banana is in the niche there of the cell. But one day I was dusting in the cell, and it was in 1882. Actually, it was the Feast of the Sacred Heart. And I found this sheet in it, which had been written in 1882. And this was 1982, and I was coming across this. And I wrote this to the author. It was a Carthusian who had been there. It would seem in the Calais area, there was a monastery there, a charter house, and there would have been a time when they would have been in exile or in some kind of formation there, English candidates. Eventually Parkminster was built and founded in Surrey. So the words on the sheet were this. It was written in just blue ink. It was found in a book that had been there in the cell for years and come to us. We had their library, it seemed. Within thy sacred heart, dear Lord, my anxious thoughts shall rest. I neither ask for life nor death, thou knowest what is best. Say only, thou hast pardoned me, say only, I am thine. In all things else dispose of me, thy holy will is mine. Ah, why is not my love for thee unbounded past control? Alas, my heart obeyeth not the impulse of my soul. Ah, Jesus, if love's trusting prayer seem not too bold for thee, place thine own heart within my breast. Love thou thyself in me. I was moved by this simple prayer, and I just sat down and wrote back to him across the century. It was the same year 100 years later, and the same feast. Or near it. So I wrote this meditation on the little sheet, remembering how he had lived exactly the same life and had gone on to eternity, de cella in caelum, from the cell to heaven. And the hint would be in that phrase that one should not need to go to purgatory. Indeed, one of the popes did say, give me a candidate who lives this rule and I will canonize him without a miracle. I forget which pope it was, but the rule, of course, has to be kept, and many are the shortcomings. One of the ones that was actually very severely dealt with was that of breaking silence. If one did break silence without permission, that is to say, without having authority to speak at the right time, then one in chapter would be obliged to mention it, and the prior would take out the discipline from the cupboard, and there would be this humiliation of being for a short time whipped with this discipline. But it was a very effective way of maintaining the silence in the house, and all billets had to be signed. Meditation on the little sheet. Sleep on, my brother, take thy rest, 'tis all far, far away. repose from what a while thou too didst know, while yet on this same shore of time that laps each hour this desert isle called solitude. 100 years have passed, and still it stands, alone in Kronos' sea. I have, like thee, on her mine anchor cast, a day or two, unmapped of history. Canst thou recall how once thou too didst stroll o'er these baked sands that seemed so numberless? How day on endless day did seem to crawl from east to west to endless emptiness? How far away did the horizon seem, on which tonight this isle seems but a dream. This is also a Wednesday in the year of St. Joseph, and the brothers always had a statue of St. Joseph where they were working. He is the patron saint of the lay brothers, and for a good reason. He was the model of quiet work done under the regard of God. He did it also in the divine regard of the Son of God, physically, but the optic is the same. And we can be sure that St. Joseph was a contemplative par excellence. He must have spoken little and been a lot. Joseph, our Father, look at this time, look again to the children. Amen. Adopting thine all thou hast folded, whom thou hast gathered to thee thine own brethren. Called by thy name, on thy name we are calling. Thy charge we all see the perils befalling. This house that shields neath the strength of thy wisdom, this child that seldom finds help in his falling. We are thy portion, we are thine own pardon. Walk thou ahead, place our feet where hast trodden. Thine own unheard and unnoticed come guiding, thy path of hiding where secrets lie hidden. For thou art unknown and wast thus in thy living, none but one ere thee saw in thy giving. And 'tis the obscure way that we too would follow, if small eyes follow our deep in striving.